Hi again, and welcome to the next in my series of myths of landscape photography. Now this is the fifth, done 4 so far. First was that landscape photography is difficult. The second, that landscape photography requires critical focus and perfect sharpness. The third, that manual exposure settings are necessary to get the best exposures. And the fourth was that the use of filters is essential for good quality landscape photographs. Now what I want to do in this is to give you the chance to look at some of my images to see if the results I achieve actually support the arguments I put forward. And I would suggest this is critical for any videos you look at on YouTube, or indeed any sources of internet information. The extent to which that information is backed up by evidence is critical in assessing how valuable the information is and how reliable and how accurate it is. So the pictures I'm going to show you here are mainly intended to give you some idea of the quality of the images that I get out. Now the first thing I'm going to do is concentrate on images taken with this camera. Now this is a Lumix GX1. It was introduced about 9 years ago. It's a 16 megapixel Micro Four Thirds camera, and I'm using it with a Lumix 12 to 32 millimeter kit lens. Now the lens has image stabilization. This model of camera doesn't have in-body stabilization, so effectively I have available up to 2 stops of image stabilization. And just to point out that this being a 12 to 32 on a Micro Four Thirds, the cropping factor means that the full frame equivalent is 24 to 64 millimeters, so fairly close to the classic 24 to 70 semi-wide angle lenses that are commonly used with Micro Four Thirds. So what I've got here is a camera that weighs less than a pound, that's dimensions allow me to put it in my pocket such that although it's not weather sealed, it's not really an issue because it goes in a waterproof pocket and it gets pulled out only when I want to use it. And the key thing about this is it is my walk around camera. It is with me all the time. And a phrase I've used before and I've doubtless come back to is I see no profit in worrying about the quality of pictures that I'm never going to take. And if I had a larger camera and if I had an immensely expensive camera, there would be times when I wouldn't take it out, I worry about getting it wet, or it would be too bulky to get in the way, particularly as a lot of my photography is taken while I'm out walking my dog. So this is a very small camera, gives me 16 megapixel, not the greatest, but 10 years ago would probably be close to state of the art in terms of pixels. So it's not a bad camera. The other thing is I bought this camera second hand. The lens was a kit lens with another camera, but I checked it on MPB and you could pick this camera up for about 50 quid. You could pick the lens up for about 90 quid. So for £140 you have got a camera that really you don't have to worry too much about. Compared with a top-end smartphone, which may well give similar optical performance, you are probably talking about a quarter of the price. So to talk about my first argument about landscape photography not being difficult, I talked about barriers to entry. The barrier to entry with this camera is very low, very convenient to use, very cheap. The other point I would make, picking up on my second video where I was talking about critical focus, this lens does not have a focus ring. To manually focus with this camera, you have to use the touchscreen at the back, which is incredibly inconvenient. So certainly with this camera, the arguments against using manual focus are pretty strong, certainly in convenience time. So what I'm going to do now is show you a little over 20 pictures. I put them up as a Lightroom slideshow to show the camera settings that I use for each shot. And what I'd like you to do is to consider the image quality, not necessarily the aesthetic quality, but the technical quality. Obviously, I hope these are images that you feel have some value aesthetically, but the key argument I'm trying to get across here is that this camera is effective for taking usable landscape photographs, and that with relatively few constraints will enable you to get good quality images. So I'm going to move on now and show you the image sequence. Hopefully that gives you an idea of the quality of the images that I've taken with this camera. I've had it for 2 years, so those pictures were taken within the last 2 years. They were all taken of National Trust property, Croom Court in Worcestershire, and as I said, they were taken on my daily dog walks. Throughout all of those pictures I used autofocus, typically picking out a point in the scene that I wanted to be critically focused, but as you will see from the EXIF data there, the apertures used on Mcro Four Thirds pretty much give me front to back focus, certainly where I wanted that to be the case. No filters were used, and the exposure was set manually, set with auto priority focus followed by manual focus adjustment, so manual exposure compensation. So the setup and the use is really not much more complicated than point and shoot. I have more control over the exposure. I can choose the point where I focus. You'll notice there that there are a couple of the images were taken at ISO 800. That's about as high as I would go with this camera, but with modern noise reduction software, then the noise really isn't too much of a problem up to 800, even with a camera that's getting on for 10 years old. So the technical difficulties to be overcome really aren't that great. In terms of print sizes, the 16 megapixel camera will essentially print without interpolation up to close to A3. So by the time you've matted that picture and put it into a frame, you're talking about a fairly sizable picture for a domestic environment. And the resolution at that on that scale, with a typical viewing distance maybe of a couple of meters, unless you're really into pixel peeping, I don't think the image quality is going to be a major concern. Certainly from my point of view, the usage I can put those pictures to is somewhat limited. The National Trust rules do not allow you to put images of their property onto stock image sites, so unlike other images I take of other sites, I can't put them up for sale as stock images. I could seek permission to use them as prints, but quite honestly the market for prints is so low it's barely worth the effort. And certainly for private use there's no restriction, so I can print these out for use in my own home and to give to friends. That's not a problem. But by and large, the largest use that I give these images is for social media use, both personally, and also I give them to the National Trust, who use them for local, regional, and some of them for national usage. And some of them have been accepted for the National Trust Images site. So the personal satisfaction and value I get out of taking these pictures is as much that they are used and valued by others, and they provide me with a source of monetary income. So hopefully the data that I presented, the pictures I presented, will convince you that the arguments that I presented have some merit, and that it's all too easy to be put off landscape photography by difficulties that are more in perception than actuality. And hopefully I will encourage you to go out, use your camera more, not be inhibited, and if it doesn't work, not be frightened to use the delete button. So hope you found this useful, and again, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.